Well, damn, you've done something here.
The Nobel Prize was given for this.
There's no need to get conceited.
Organ number 1.
Some biochemical and molecular biological processes that can make humanity happy.
With the power of thought, you can change, well, like a brain or something.
The cerebellum fell off.
That is, the brain is like a muscle, it needs to be trained.
Idlers. Our brain just doesn't sit still.
In a stream with Arat Kairolan.
You are one of the few people who are both a scientist, a popularizer, and an ideological inspirer, so it's a great pleasure to be here in Kazan today.
Thank you.
Today I wanted to talk about this beautiful.
What a cheerful one you have.
A beautiful human organ, like the brain, because, you know, we are all people, we take care of our health, we buy cream so that we have good skin, we buy shampoos so that we have silky hair. But about a human organ like the brain, which works around the clock, controls our body, it is not always clear how to take care of it so that it, as they say, performs its functions. I wanted to talk about this today in different aspects.
In fact, Arat, our brain just doesn't sit still, and it obviously hints to us.
Vyacheslav Dubynin, 61 years old, professor, doctor of biological sciences, physiologist, leading researcher at the Department of Human and Animal Physiology of the Faculty of Biology of Moscow State University, writer.
Yeah, I need to eat. After all, this signal does not come from the intestine, but from the brain. I need a drink. This signal also comes not from any kidneys, but from the brain. And he also says, something is boring, give me new information. Something lonely, where is our love? Yes, that is, in fact, the brain tells us very well about its needs, so it is quite such an active organ.
Number 1, organ number 1.
Yes, yes, of course, of course.
But from the point of view of evolution, when did the brain of living organisms appear at all? He probably didn't always exist. That is, some kind of evolutionary process, called the restructuring of the body.
Operating time, yes. Well, look, life appeared as a unicellular phenomenon. According to evolutionists, this happened about 4 billion years ago. Well, such an approximate figure, but it allows you to imagine the scale of what is happening. And then 3 billion years of evolution perfected the cell. And about 1 billion years ago, multicellular organisms appeared, which eventually gave Homo sapiens, a person. It's also like such an interesting idea to create a cage. That's 3. It's 3 times more difficult than making a sentient being out of a cage. That's why we're so conceited.
Time to keep in mind.
Yes, you don't need to be arrogant, do you? And in general, it's surprising that everything is so complicated in the cell. All these genes are regulated, proteins, that's it. Well, in any case, at the moment when multicellular cells already appeared, a problem arose. But how to manage all this? Because, well, what kind of transition is there? There were cells, then at some point it turns out that after division, it may not diverge in different directions, form such piles, colonies, yes, colonial unicellular, but further inside this colony, why not divide the functions? Let someone be responsible for digestion, someone for movement, someone for being a protective layer on the surface, yes, it turns out skin. And dividing the functions inside such a homogeneous aggregate turned out to be a cool evolutionary idea, but someone has to manage. And at very early stages of evolution, nerve cells are already appearing. Well, I think that schoolchildren who, hopefully, will listen to this podcast, they will immediately scream of course, of course. Worms and coelenterates already have a nervous system, and the simplest creatures that get into the school curriculum, well, something like coral polyps, jellyfish, they also have nerve cells fairly evenly scattered throughout the body. And worms, in general, also do not have such very, very large clusters. But at the level of the smartest worms, it is already clear that there is obviously a head where there are most nerve cells. In general, the head, by the way, also does not immediately appear, right? I mean, I don't know, take some kind of starfish, there's no head there, right? And as if she has the main beam, no. It only means in the cartoon about SpongeBob, there's this Patrick standing on the back of some rays, and one of them is the head. Not really. That is, the idea to create a head, it is connected with the fact that it would be nice to have some part of the body that we will be the first to poke into an unknown place, and there we need to put, well, eyes, olfactory organs, here. And since there are eyes, olfactory organs, there you also need to take out a processor that will process signals. And the head appears, where clusters of neurons working with the sensory organ are concentrated. And at this level, the mouth is still in the middle of the abdomen. There are such flatworms, planaria, they are also in the school textbook. They have a mouth in the middle of their stomach, and there are also a lot of nerve cells there, so that the pharynx is there and everything works. And the second cluster is in the head, where it already means rudimentary eyes. And then the mouth goes forward. What if somewhere in the forest, and there's food, it's even faster to eat, otherwise the food will run away. Well, as a result, there is already our plan of structure, that is, something long, at one end of the mouth and nervous system, and at the other the exit from the digestive tract. Both the brain and neurons. In general, this is an integrating mechanism that perceives signals, processes and triggers reactions. And there are two main types of reactions. We move our muscles and the work of our internal organs changes. Plus, some additional factors are taken into account. I ate, I didn't eat, I have fat reserves or not, it's time to multiply. It didn't come, the day, night. All this must be taken into account in the course of behavior in order for the body to be effective. And so the nervous system begins to take on more and more tasks, more and more neurons. Organisms are getting bigger. Because in the course of evolution, it turns out that being big is cool. Because if you are big, then you no longer have every congress, but you can eat many. Therefore, the enlargement of the body. This is just such a leitmotif. Well, it came to dinosaurs or the same elephant whales there. These are such obvious examples. And a big body needs a big nervous system, and this is also an important task. At some point, organisms begin to live in packs. Here is the idea of the flock. It repeats the idea of the transition from unicellular to multicellular. That is, one is good, but together it is even better. And now a flock of one individual is also good, but in a pack it is better, safer, and already in a pack there may be a division of functions. There's a pack leader, yes, someone is hunting, someone is taking care of children, someone there, I don't know, a night watchman, someone, the guardian of wisdom, here. And in order for relationships, hierarchy, empathy, and concern for offspring to form, appropriate neural networks also arise, and the brain acquires, as it were, the properties of caring not only for itself, but also caring for its neighbor. And so all this goes on in the course of evolution. Well, then we actually see that we have three main peaks of brain development on the planet. Here is our line, the vertebrate line, which at some point divides into birds and mammals. Both have very powerful brains. And some crow, she is no less intelligent than a medium-sized monkey and smarter than a dog on all cognitive tests. Well, everyone knows that a crow is trickier than a dog, it is.
Parrot again.
Parrots. Well, you won't meet a parrot on the streets of Kazan right away, right? Defense is easy. Here, the second line of evolution. These are clams, and clams have a top. These are cephalopods. Large octopuses, large squids. Well, we don't know much about squid, they are there in the depths of the ocean, but large octopuses, they use tools, they decorate, for example, the surroundings of their burrow, clean up all the garbage and lay out some pretty shells. Here, they have a very difficult communication. But octopuses have one problem. They reproduce once in a lifetime, most species, and then die. And this, apparently, did not allow them to reach such heights of intelligence. Well, the third line, these are social insects. These are bees, ants, all sorts of termites, wasps. There are small brains, but very powerful. And so, fortunately, again, evolution has not found a way, but for all the ants to unite there with antennae, a supernetwork has emerged. If that happened, there would be no people on the planet.
The mind is like that.
Yes, there would be no people on the planet, because these arthropods, they are very many millions of years old, right? That is, all these ants have existed for 200 million years. But somehow it didn't work out. That is, evolution. This is a random process. That is, mutations occur. If some species has caught this mutation and it is useful, including, yes, it develops. Yes, they are useful for survival, for reproduction, and including mutations associated with brain development, then this is picked up. And then, it means, it begins to multiply in a number of generations. And so we can say that our biological species has won a colossal jackpot. That is, we were the first on this planet to become intelligent. And no matter how cool it is, we have a huge responsibility. I would not like to tear this planet to pieces. But here we are first. We have overtaken birds, we have overtaken cephalopods, we have overtaken social insects.
Well, first of all, it turns out, from an evolutionary point of view, the number of neurons for the size of the brain, or the weight of the brain, it increased, and we became smarter from this, right? Vertebrates, mammals.
Well, in fact, everyone can, not
only the biggest brain, or are we the smartest in terms of what? The number of neurons, or how to determine?
Well, you could say that each neuron is a rather complex microchip. Therefore, the number of neurons, of course, largely determines the computing resources of a particular nervous system.
How many neurons do we, a person, have on average?
Well, about 90 billion. 90 billion neurons is 10 times more than the number of inhabitants on planet Earth. And how would it be very impressive?
And the monkey, if after us, which evolutionarily stand?
If we take our closest relatives of the great apes, then there are somewhere up to 10 billion. That's if you take a large burner.
Pets?
A cat or a dog has somewhere closer to 1 billion neurons, but a human, yes, are 90 billion, but it's really not the biggest brain. That is, an elephant has a brain 3 times larger than ours, a whale has twice as much brain. And here we actually see that it's not just the size of the brain, but also the ratio of body weight and brain size. Because if you have a large body, then you need a lot of neurons in order to read skin sensitivity, muscle sensitivity, and control muscles and internal organs again. That is, you have a lot of administrative resources, as it were, to work in specific territories. Do you understand? Yes, and as if only a limited number of managers are engaged in higher functions anyway. And as if, since there are a lot of things, there are such routine tasks, there are also a lot of them and a lot of nerve cells are needed in order to really cope with muscles and skin sensitivity. And, in fact, such a real resource is the higher brain. It is determined by how many neurons there are in the cerebral cortex.
The bark is that.
Yes, the bark is what's right here.
Here, the cerebellum, right?
Here, the cerebellum fell off. Here it is, in fact, even with us it contains the most neurons by mass, by quantity. That is, there are 2/3 of all neurons in the human cerebellum.
2/3.
In the cerebellum.
In size, as if it is incomparable, yes.
In size, it is almost an order of magnitude smaller than the large hemispheres. And an elephant, a whale, has 90% of neurons in the cerebellum in general, because it is the cerebellum that controls movements, and a lot of nerve cells are needed for a large body. We have the most neurons in the cerebral cortex. Here, yes, here in this surface area. Here we have about 30 billion neurons, and the elephant whale has, well, somewhere no more than 10 billion.
By the word carrot, this part is meant here, right?
So, see how the brain works globally. Right here, yes, this ancient part, it's called the trunk. It is an extension of the spinal cord. And on this trunk, as on the trunk of a tree, grows the cerebellum, our motor memory, motor center, and large hemispheres. What does it mean growing? Here is the upper part of the trunk, it is called the intermediate brain. Why? Because it is located exactly between the 2 hemispheres, that is, this area here. When an embryo develops, an intermediate brain appears at the beginning, and then 2 hemispheres grow out of it like this. And the hemispheres have the main cluster of neurons, and these are the main synapses where information is processed on the surface. And this was once called the bark. The fact is that those areas where there are a lot of neurons and where there are a lot of synapse contacts, where processing is going on, they visually look darker, they were called gray matter. And then these zones, which are processed, that is, in fact, the boards of our brain computer, need to somehow transmit information. And this information is transmitted with the help of processes that are more light-colored. And this is called white matter. And so, in fact, how are our large hemispheres arranged? On top of the bark, gray matter, and further from it to the same trunk there are already fibers, and we see white matter under the bark. Then what is important? The larger the area of the crust, the more computing resources. Therefore, evolution creates a bunch of these furrows, convolutions. Gray matter enters all the furrows, gyri. That is, a computing resource. Yes, it is defined.
The volume per unit of space is greater.
1. Volume. I usually compare this to a situation when you put things on vacation and the first shirts are there, or you put blouses evenly, and then you need another blouse, another. And yes, and everything bends. But it fit. That's about the same, because the head can't be too big, it's still necessary to give birth. That's why it can't be infinitely large. And so evolution is trying, yes, compactness is somehow more or less harmoniously combined with computing resources.
And how did it happen that a person has two hemispheres? For some reason, we have one heart, it's not from the hemisphere, but the brain is from the hemisphere. What is it? How? Well, is it necessary?
That's how we can only hypothesize, because, once again, evolution goes by chance. Two hemispheres. This, apparently, is a reflection of our global bilateral symmetry. That is, in general, our line of evolution in vertebrates, it has bilateral symmetry.
Two hands, two eyes, right?
Yes, two arms, two eyes, two ears, two legs. That is, our worm ancestors, yes, were such flat pancakes that lay at the bottom. And then we grow paws on the sides. And it turns out already two-sided symmetry and two eyes to look right and left. That's how it happened. Well, in general, it is believed that this is the structure of both the large hemispheres and the cerebellum, which also has two large hemispheres. It reflects our bilateral symmetry. But not everything in our brain is paired. Yes, there is one pituitary gland or there is one epiphysis, one hypothalamus. But there are already two thalamuses here. But, in principle, this is our bilateral structure, it is like this. And as for the heart, apparently, yes. The problem is that you need to create a uniform blood pressure throughout the body. And make, for example, two hearts. Then they need to be synchronized. And evolution somehow chose this option.
Vyacheslav, but how well does science now understand how the human brain works?
Well, we already know the anatomy very well. Although, of course, it can be seen at some level how individual our brain is anyway, both in terms of the size of specific departments, and the number of neurons in these departments, and the specifics of connections. Here, but so on an average level, in general, all this is described very well. There is a wonderful Brazilian scientist Susana Furculana Hausel. She is the best in the world at counting the number of nerve cells in any brain and in any departments. Here she has wonderful articles about the human brain, about the brain of a monkey, about the brain of China, about the brain of an elephant. She recently had a paper comparing the brains of marsupials or comparing the brains of parrots. Parrots, by the way, have an amazing brain, just like crows. That is, the highest line of evolution, the highest groups of birds, they have, if we look at the mood of the brain, there, firstly, the density of neurons per unit volume is very high, and, secondly, there are a lot of contacts per unit volume. Because in general, the computational resource of the brain does not depend on the weight or even on the number of neurons, but on how many contacts, for example, per cubic millimeter.
The number of links.
These connections, because they are the structural and functional unit of the brain. And the brains of birds, especially public ones, such as ravens and such as parrots, they are in places the same as in humans. And in a sense, we are again Homo sapiens lucky that birds were not the first to become intelligent on this planet. This is probably due to the fact that birds fly, and every gram of their weight is taken into account. They save on everything. Well, I don't know, they're birds, for example, females have only one ovary, yes, that is, as if we save on this. There are no teeth, yes, we save on this. Therefore, a big brain, and how to fly with him. And it turns out that birds have a very compact brain, well, like an APPL. Yes, and mammals are more so smeared in space by the brain, but we don't need to save every gram. It's like this. The usual beam architecture. That is, a bigger computer, but cheaper, simpler. here. And as if in the end not VE.
But if we understand a little anatomically, we probably understand well how some departments are arranged. But the cutting edge of science in the field of neuroscience or the study of the brain, where are they today? That's what scientists are focused on to better understand how the brain works. Or what discoveries, perhaps, of the last 5 or 6 years have given us the opportunity to move forward and understand more about this amazing organ.
You know, the work here goes in 2 directions, as it were. That's in the direction of deepening our knowledge about molecular mechanisms and in the direction of understanding how it works as such a powerful unified system. And here, first of all, the human brain is of course important. That is, on the one hand, work, for example, on the mechanisms of memory or, for example, there is a lot of work on epigenetics right now, how, for example, yes, stress chronically affects the functioning of genes in the same neurons in childhood and how it then affects the likelihood of panic attacks, the likelihood of depression, yes. That is epigenetics.
That is, the environment can influence, trigger some dormant genetic processes.
Epigenetic. The word epigenetics is still, as it were, probably not everyone knows. That is, we are talking about genetics and genes as DNA molecules. And indeed we have these molecules in every cell. It records what proteins to make, and proteins will continue to perform different functions. And there are genes of different proteins there. But the trick is that in order for the gene to work, you need a bunch of additional factors, and in the end it turns out that the gene does not function on the principle of all or nothing, but on the principle of 20% of possible activity, 40 there or 70 there or 95 there. And this is the understanding that a gene can work, for example, by 40%, or maybe by 60, and then the amount of, for example, dopamine in your brain will be different, and you will be a different person by temperament. It's like everything comes gradually, and this applies in general to all genes and, as it were, the endocrine system, the immune system. And then what is revealed? These changes in the activity of genes, they are largely determined not by real mutations, but by microchanges in the DNA molecule itself. Well, when, for example, the so-called methylation occurs, that is, the methyl group C(S3) is attached by the nucleotide and from this the gene, for example, is read with less probability. And it also turned out, well, actually, it turned out a long time ago that DNA is connected to auxiliary proteins in our cell nucleus, histones that, the matrix on which the DNA is wound is such a rod. And the state of histones also affects the probability of reading the gene. And there is the concept of histone acetylation, when a gene is read with a 40% probability, with 60, with 80. And then what happens? That just DNA methylation and histone acetylation is, for example, under the influence of some stress hormones. Yes, or there's some kind of chronic starvation or something. And after it happened, this altered state of the gene, it can persist for years, or even decades. And this,
not strongly.
This is not real genetics, but it's about genetics, so the name is epigenetics. But then, for example, it turns out that this state it can even pass into germ cells. Yes, that is, well, the same spermatozoa, eggs, they also contain genes.
So it turns out that you can transmit this new information in a genetic way.
Yes, that it will be passed on to the next generation, but not through true genetics, not through DNA modification. There, when the sequence of nucleotides changes and another protein is obtained, and through a change in the probability of reading the gene, the activity of the gene. And this is just what our scientific brain takes out. Well, because, well, as always, everything is more complicated than we thought. And I literally spoke at a psychological congress 2 days ago and updated my knowledge in the field of epigenetics of post-traumatic stress disorder. And now there are works that show that, for example, abuse in childhood or some other unpleasant events, they seriously change the status of the brain at the epigenetic level, but then if, for example, some kind of psychotherapy, but only for a long time, then these epigenetic modifications can go away.
The reverse process, how would you go back to?
There are still very few such works, but they do not always look reliable. But they are published in serious scientific journals, that is, as if they can be trusted. And this understanding, it's like it's just been sent.
And if it's easier to formulate it in a more everyday way, is it possible to say that the power of thought can be changed? Well, like a brain or something?
Yes, in general it is possible, but it will not be very easy.
It may not be very simple and not very short, but this is quite what is called a scientifically proven fact. Yes, it turns out.
Well, the power of thought is generally quite a material thing, yes, that is, it can also be measured, or at least understand where everything is located here in neural networks. That is, we have a special area of temina temporo-occipital. Yes, well, yes, here I also have a half here, about here at the junction, yes, yellow, green and blue here in this zone. Because the temporal zone is shown in yellow, auditory. This is the hearing zone, and this is the processing zone of complex auditory images. But in this zone, auditory signals are already part of speech, understanding words, and thinking. This is the zone of skin sensitivity, and here the skin sensitivity is involved again in some speech functions. Green vision. And here visual signals begin to participate again in the understanding of words, reading and writing. This zone is dark temporo-occipital. This is the zone that Pavlov referred to as the second signal system. Speech. That is, our highest manifestation of our mental activity is the formation of speech centers, that is, special neural networks that are able to interact with different sensory systems. Well, some kind of orange, we know what it looks like, what it feels like, what it tastes like, we also know the word orange, and even in several languages.
Did you imagine the color right away?
Yes. And so, as it were, and the color, and
integrated formation at one's unit of time.
Here, this integration, it must also happen somewhere on some neurons. And it is clear that this task is more difficult than just sight or just hearing. And it is even anatomically logical that this zone is located at the junction of sensory zones. Here. And that's where our speech centers are formed, and there are more and more of them. By the age of 3, age psychology says that the vocabulary grows to about 2,000 words, at which point the child has what Stephen Hawking called an information speech model of the world. That is, one of the super tasks of our brain is to create a cast of the surrounding reality here.
Does it happen in 3 years?
Well, at the age of 3, this system well acquires integrity and a process of thinking arises. That is, the neural network begins to drive signals inside itself, think, fantasize and predict the consequences of its behavior. That is, in general, apparently, in evolution this thing arises in order to look ahead. And what happens if, and I'm going to do this, what will happen, and it will turn out badly, so, perhaps, we will not do it.
Indicative of brain function, right?
Yes, predictive. That is, in fact, such a super task of the brain is to look ahead.
Do animals not have such a function?
There is, of course. There is, of course. Well, do you have pets?
Not now.
And any dogs, cats?
Well, there were.
Well, here's a dog, right? Here she is sitting in the kitchen, and in front of her there is, I don't know, a bag of sausages. And she sits and saliva flows, but does not touch the sausages. That is, you can see right how she has there in this dog neural networks, like you can't touch, yes, I'll get into trouble for it. That is, some kind of forecast, of course, and animals realize. Of course, not everything is there on reflexes and innate programs, here. But in the case of animals, but especially dogs, cats, we are talking mainly about some kind of imaginative thinking. Its beginning. But on the other hand, dogs also understand a certain number of words, but they have few of these speech centers, because, apparently, they also have few neurons capable of such a complex function. That is, the most super dogs, and these, in my opinion, are border collies, and these are pastoral ones who do not live in an apartment, but actually graze sheep somewhere there on the highlands of Scotland, so they know 150, 200 teams. When they started working with great apes, this is a huge layer of research, it turned out that a small chimpanzee, a small gorilla can be taught language. Yes, well, you just have to perform a feat, and here are the monkey cubs who have taken him as their own child, communicating for many hours with him, calling everything with words, and also showing with sign language. Because the monkey can't tell, her vocal cords are not adapted. And he can use sign language, the language of the deaf and dumb.
But this famous story burned Coco.
Here, yes, here it is.
Was it clarified by sign language? How many wrote? Has she mastered thousands of deaf-mute gestures?
Well, there's an average of usually.
She could.
700 or 800, but it seems even up to 1,000. That is.
Did she talk with gestures to people?
Yes, that kind of monkey.
She understood people through gestures.
they understand much more.
And where is the line between what she understood and just a reflex? Here conditionally, I give it like Pavel's reflex. Here I show you a candy, you have to do some action from your fingers.
When we say reflex in such a classic version, it is usually a reaction triggered by a stimulus. You were shown a candy bar, and you say, oh, it's a candy bar. It's a reflex at the level of the second signal system, as Ivan Petrovich Pavlov wrote. But now imagine a situation that you wanted something sweet, yes, and this candy appears in your inner eye, and you say, should I eat a candy? And this is no longer a reflex, yes, that is, your memory is involved without an obvious internal stimulus. The analog of the stimulus is the signal from the hunger center is so vague, and maybe you will want candy today, and tomorrow there, I don't know, a sausage sandwich.
That is, it turns out that this burned cocoa could say with a gesture, let me go for a walk, I'll go for a walk for half an hour and return to the aviary.
Well, I do not know about half an hour, but it would be nice to take a walk. Yes, that's easy. At least I'm thirsty there, give me a glass of orange juice. That is, such monkeys build phrases from a dozen words. They communicate with each other using these languages. Monkey mothers spontaneously teach this language to their cubs. And all this, of course, is terribly interesting. And this level is about 1,000 words. This is the level of a child, well, not yet at 3, well, say, at 2.5 years.
I came, so we started talking about the information model of the language model that a 3-year-old child has. I understand correctly that just this impression is like an external reality, which is imprinted on the human brain in a 3-year period. The problem of Mowgli, that is, if the child got into a wolf pack.
Well, yes, or just lives.
And then he will no longer become a man, because the brain is not able to make him a man. It's from this series, yes, it turns out.
Well, it's from this series. This is also called sensitive periods. That is, some events, they must happen on time. And if a child up to 3 years old had extremely united communication, and, unfortunately, these are not only stories with Mowgli, but all sorts of clinical historians there. The 20th century, there were a lot of such stories, and even now they continue. But sometimes it's really such a clinical story, when not quite, to put it mildly, normal parents, yes, the child is not allowed to walk there. Here is a closed room. Ah, you're guilty, so sit down. They don't communicate. And the vocabulary is not growing, constant stress. And if you step over the level of 3 or 4 years, the restoration of vocabulary and normal behavior is very difficult. Well, the same children, Mowgli. Just stories about children, Mowgli them here on the fingers of one hand, and the story of sensory deprivation, when children grew up in conditions of very cruel treatment, unfortunately, there are a lot of them. But, as a rule, if it happened there before 7 or 8 years, a lot more can be restored. And then the brain, as it were, closes the resources for some kind of modification of neural networks, and everything is complicated. This is what we say in a variety of stories. We say that it is easy to learn a second language there at preschool age, and at 20, 30 it is more difficult, and at 60 it is quite difficult, but it is possible. It just takes a long time to rest.
But there is also such a fact that the number of newborns. Here they said that a person has 90 billion neurons, newborn Krish neurons 180 billion they receive. Do these neurons decrease over time or disappear from the human brain? What is the reason for this?
Yes, this is also such a very interesting story, beautiful. That is, our neurons are formed in excess. And when a child is born, in general, all the neurons are already in place, but there are still few processes between them and contacts. That is, in general, normally, yes, a neuron will have these processes in large numbers, and each neuron forms several thousand contacts, synapses with other neurons. And this is the primary formation of a neural network, especially when we are talking about the cerebral cortex, about our higher centers. It is going on most intensively just in these 2, 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years. And at this moment, the cortex has the largest number of contacts, but these contacts mostly still work very poorly. Because there were no events yet, there was no information. So what happens next? Here we live, yes, we are engaged in this business, this there, well, conditionally there the child is 4 years old and he dances there, and also goes there to draw, and maybe they're on Lego and collect some robots there or something else. Well, as if communicating with adults. These are the parts of the neural network that are actively loaded, where synapses begin to work more actively, conduct information, they produce energy more intensively, there are all sorts of protein molecules, these contacts, and, as if everything is okay, everything is going fine there. And in some parts of the brain, in some parts of the cerebral cortex, there are fewer signals. Well, it's just that you can't make it in 24 hours, and this, and this, and this. Again, imagine, it's one thing for a child who grows up in a small town or village, and another thing is a child of a megalopolis. That is, in many ways, by the way, the strength of our Homo sapiens. Our brain, the ship of all people, is in many ways initially empty and ready to remember anything. Therefore,
And the bad?
well, now we are not even talking about the good and the bad, but about different living conditions. And we can adapt to live in a tropical forest, in the Sahara Desert, on the shore, I don't know the Kara Sea there. That is, we are very plastic. And this is a child's age, it's like such a prerogative in many ways, yes, that is, tuning into those parameters of the world that you got right here. Well, that's it. So those parts of the neural network of the cortex that are loaded with a small amount of information, synapses begin to break there. This mechanism was described not so long ago. That is, it turned out that we have special neuroglial cells in our brain, they are called neuroglia, which monitor whether the synapse is working. In general, they are originally cells of the immune system, that is, such small phagocytes that wander between neurons there and clean up garbage or catch, God forbid, any bacteria, viruses. But one of the tasks of microglia, listen to synapses, that is, these contacts. So, the microglial cell forms such an outgrowth and, like, well, are you working? And if the synapse does not transmit signals, there is a command to break. This process was called pruning. This is an English word that means pruning a hedge. Here, that is, synapses that do not work, they begin to break. This is logical, because every synapse requires energy. Why feed a certain contact, a certain structure, so to speak, again when compared with the administration, yes, your department, which is not really needed, yes, let's cut it, and divide the salary on the rest. And that's actually how the neural network works. That is, those contacts that are not active are broken. Moreover, if a neuron has lost a lot of contacts, then it is already dying. And that's when it says that children have a lot of neurons, and then their number begins to decrease and reaches about 30 to 90 billion years there at this age. This is the very process. That is, neurons that could not integrate into the team are leaving, and the redistribution of energy goes to the working parts of the neural network. Here, as if more subtle processes are connected with the fact that the neural network itself is formed largely by chance. You see, here we have a complex brain. Here it arises and there I don't know, the child immediately begins to function. And the baby was born there, yes, he breathes there, he sucks his mother's breast. That is, some simple chains of neurons by the way, most likely reflex arcs, yes, it turns out that they fit the definition of reflex arcs, they work great right away. But the cortex of the large hemispheres is almost empty. The cerebellar cortex is also almost empty. We still have to develop motor skills. It turns out that the loaded elements of the neural network, they are strengthened, they are not loaded, they begin to gradually go away. And we call this neural network optimization. At the chemical level, and this is just such a separate story. There is the cell that transmits signals, the cell that is received, they exchange special molecules, they are called nerve growth factors. That is, in fact, it's like these internal hormones of the brain that tell the neurons involved in contact that you are needed, and these signals from growth factors are transmitted to the nucleus of the neuron, and if they are not there, then the neuron will die. That is, at first, idlers die, it looks like optimization until the age of 30 or 40.
Up to 30 or 40.
Well, optimization, yes, but they continue to die, because if you live too much the same, too boring, without new impressions, right?
That is, on the same road to work.
Exactly, yes. Do you read the same books or do you not read at all?
Watch the same channel on the TV.
Yes, that's it, that's it.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel stream, be in the trend of new news, new guests, information.
Yes, and your neurons will rejoice, yes, and not die from monotony. If you are still, yes, at the age of 70 you are going to learn how to paint with watercolor, then the part of the brain that is able to do it in principle and which has already lost some number of nerve cells, it will sigh with difficulty, like where were you before?
Tense up, right?
But it will strain, and those neurons that remain, they will begin to grow new processes and grow synapses.
Wow.
Yes, that is, we know that neurons do not recover, yes, such a phrase.
Nerve cells do not regenerate.
They don't restore it. Why? What does it mean it doesn't recover? Not shared, because for our ordinary organ, restoration is division. Here's the liver, for example. A person can poison his liver with anything, yes, I don't know, with the same alcohol.
Well, or it was cut off, for example.
Or cut off, yes. No wonder Prometheus.
They spat.
The eagle was pecking at the liver. That is, the ancient Greeks already knew that the liver has amazing regeneration. Yes, and liver cells divide, and regenerate. Recovered. Neurons don't divide. And this is not their defect, them.
There are stroke manifestations here, it's impossible to restore brain activity, right? What if they died?
But if they died, you will not restore them in any way. Neurons, in principle, do not divide, because they are forbidden to share, because thousands of information channels essentially pass through each neuron. And if you divide it, you will tear them apart. It's like cutting a book in half diagonally. You will not get two books, but a kind of broken book that cannot be read. And we have only two areas in the brain where neurons continue to divide even in adulthood, because there are very stereotypical functions. This is the area of the hippocampus of short-term memory and olfactory centers, which, in principle, are focused on the fact that, perhaps, we will also remember this smell, and also remember this one. But this is rather an exception. In the main cortex of the cerebral hemispheres, neurons do not divide, so when, for example, a person has a stroke and some of the neurons die, this is a disaster. But it's the same story as with watercolors. If you start loading this zone with the information that was processed by the dead neurons, then the surviving neurons, with a heavy sigh, will grow new appendages, form contacts and mend a hole in the neural network. And sometimes this patched-up construction works no worse than the original one and even gets some new properties. It's about the size of the damage. Therefore, microstrokes, there is a recovery without problems. The larger the lesion, the more problems. And sometimes a person recovers after a stroke for 5 years, for 10 years. But it's important to work here. Yes, I have a stroke there and my right arm doesn't move and it's hard and even painful to move it. Oh my God, I'm going to hang her on this very bandage and not move her at all. That's the worst thing that can happen. Because if you don't move, even those neurons that could help in recovery, they, too, will give up and do something else. And it is necessary through pain, through I don't want to do all this. Doctors who are engaged in rehabilitation are constantly talking about it. And, returning to watercolors, yes, if you still decided to learn how to paint in watercolor at the age of 70, or I don't know whether to do origami or have taken up learning Portuguese, then they will release neurons, appendages, form synapses. But it will be an order of magnitude more difficult and will require an order of magnitude more effort from you than, for example, in 5 years or in 7 years. When they say that in life you have to move all the time and it's like an analogy with an escalator, yes, which goes down, and you have to walk all the time to stay in place.
Just to stay put.
On the spot.
You need to progress so that you don't slide back, right?
Yes, I didn't slide down to the state of a worm at all, that's it.
That is, the brain is like a muscle, it needs to be trained, eventually.
Well, yes. Rather, I would say that our whole body is so arranged. That is, the body that does not train, it degrades, because there is a saving of resources.
That there may be a feeling, that's when we talk about children who have 150, 180 billion neurons, which then chronic happens. It can't be a feeling that the child needs to be loaded into action more, that's early development. Let's teach him to read in 2 years, teach him to write in 3 years. We will give up school not at the age of 7, but at the age of 5. Let him know 3 languages by the age of 5. Do we see such processes, as it were? It may be a plus to be that we will load the child so that her neurons will not die off the relationship and he will need them. Before us, there will be a kind of humanity that will have 130 billion neurons of action.
It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. There are 24 hours in a day, so if you load a child with Portuguese, instead of sculpting something out of plasticine with him as a mom-dad, for example, yes, I don't know, then neural networks that are about Portuguese will develop, but networks will not develop, for example, empathy, family affection.
Coordination can be, right?
Yes, or, for example,
it doesn't make sense to ride a scooter, does it?
Yes, well, for example. Do you understand? That is, here we are still talking about the redistribution of resources. If you take on a child very intensively and too early, then you are still developing some functions to the detriment of other functions. Moreover, you can by creating this overload, and it happens to be an overload, yes, especially when the parent is there. How did you not take first place in the competition? Oh my God, I'm so. This stress, it's just completely traumatic. And psychologists have written volumes about this and say that parents often realize their own ambitions through children.
Traumatizing even in some way.
Traumatizing them at the same time, yes. When we choose a profession as adults, we do the same thing. Why did I become an economist or a physicist there, or a medical doctor there, or a sociologist there? And probably something hit me right then at 15, 16, 17 years old and I liked it. And what? And sometimes at the same age of 16 or 17, when a child chooses a profession, for example, a university, some factors work, such as a good salary, or my best friend also became like this, yes, a specialist. And probably, either it is customary in our family, or just my parents said. When you start working, and you suddenly realize that work does not bring you positive emotions, that's where the trouble happens. Well, psychologists call it professional burnout, but in reality it means that you need to change your profession. Because it means that you are stressed all the time, and your neurons start to die from this. Stress, by the way, yes, there's just such a story. This pruning accelerates, the probability of the death of individual nerve cells increases, and it is necessary to change the profession in a good way. Despite the fact that one part of our brain says damn, it's new again, yes, well, we just built it all, only we are fine and here to a new place and sort of solve new problems. This is one part of the brain that is behind the stereotype, and we have laziness programs in which, therefore, are about walking in the usual ways. The other part of the brain, which is about novelty, it rejoices and says, now we will earn a lot of dopamine. Now, well, new tasks. Yes, we are almost all here. That's what we've already figured out. Are there any new tasks? Here, too, we are all different, yes, it's not for nothing that there have been choleric, phlegmatic, melancholic, sanguine since the time of Hippocrates. That's phlegmatic. Stability is just important to him. And as if yes, I have integrated into the structure, I am a small cog there in this large organization, I benefit, he is comfortable. And sanguine and choleric. He is bored, he wants to lead, and he wants novelty. Well, apparently, evolution, when it created us again, it also created us different. In general, diversity is also one of the leitmotifs of the evolutionary process. That's all this in the end harmoniously combined. And melancholics, by the way, are considered as the most creative type, because they have such loose, anxious brains. They are not very comfortable in some crisis situations, but if they are placed in such a white tower, yes, feed them and not scare them, they can think of that. What other temperaments will not think of. Therefore, for example, people of art, they often have such an anxious melancholic temperament. And even better is this bipolarity. Sometimes you're depressed, then you have mania and creative impulses. A lot of great people were like this, yes, bipolar. Well, the classic is Pushkin. That means depression, then Boldenskaya autumn. The fact is that neuroanatomy itself, but weight or even cellular structures. Well, it's like opening a computer and looking at hardware, but you don't see any programs. And you can put different programs. In fact, well, for example, if you take a piece of the cerebral cortex of a mouse and a human, you can't tell them apart under a microscope.
Really?
Yes, that's it. Yes, that is, you can't distinguish neurons and synapses through a microscope. Moreover, you cannot distinguish between a man and a monkey. That's why it's a lot of things. No, the specificity of iron is also important, yes, that is, the density of synaptic contacts, there are how many of them per unit volume. But the specifics manifest themselves and we upload programs to these neural networks. Yes, that is our individual experience, which again begins with the first days, weeks of life and even earlier. From the moment when the child stirred in the mother's stomach, it already started ringing neural networks. Why is the baby moving? And here are some simple reflexes first, and then motor skills. Already the cerebellum has begun to learn.
He hears some external sounds, music through his mother's stomach.
Well, or the rumbling in my mother's stomach, for example. Yes, he hears the beating of my mother's heart. Of course. That is, from the age of 7 months, the child already hears quite well. He moved even earlier. And now on ultrasound we see that the child, for example, sucks a finger from his mother in the womb. That is, already, yes, this sucking reflex, it seems to be ringing. That is, well, just like you are launching some kind of production complex, you are testing before you launch it. Here such testing is still going on in utero. And it is useful because neurons begin to transmit signals to each other, feed each other with these growth factors. And the assembly is more adequate. Apparently, the assembly at the site of many neural networks begins there in utero. Therefore, we now understand that these 9 months, while the baby is growing in the mother's stomach, they are of enormous importance for the future temperament, for the future parameters of intelligence. Well, there are, as it were, such very rough estimates, and what contribution, what factors contribute to a person's personality. Here are 50% of these genes, that is, those DNA molecules that came from mom, dad, their installations, yes, their characteristics. There is a lot of serotonin, a lot of dopamine, little dopamine. Then 20% is the intrauterine period.
A big number.
Very big. 15% are the first years of life, well, say, preschool. And the remaining 15% is everything that has happened to us since school, institute, work. Here, that is, the intrauterine period, according to what we will be, well, at least we will compare, and perhaps even more important than everything from the interval from 70 to, I don't know, 97 years.
And the big differences between male and female brains.
You know, they usually fit into this normal distribution again. That is, when the question is asked about the male-female brain, what do we see? There are many differences on big statistics. Well, it's a banal level there, I don't know, aggressiveness of some kind, or there is a level of care for offspring. On average, we see this. And if you take 10,000 men, 10,000 women, you will get a statistically significant difference. There is less than 0 there.
Or the size of the weight, probably 2, right?
Size, weight, yes. But if you take a specific man, a specific woman, then within these 2 normal distributions, he can get anywhere. These 2 normal male-female distributions overlap very much. They overlap by more than 70%. We are different men and women. Yes, we have a Y chromosome in men, women do not have it, instead of it the second X chromosome. That's where it all starts. And what is there to be surprised that our brains are different? So we have everything different. Our liver works differently, our heart works differently. After all, men live on average 5 years less. Does this strike anyone? And it's like a frontal story, because Igor's chromosome it works. Well, it is known to be shorter than X, and about 800 genes in a man in 1 copy, and in women in 2, because 2 X chromosomes.
Did we miss something?
Yes, and if one of these 800 genes is broken, then women have a backup option, their second C chromosome, and men do not. Therefore, many genetic diseases, the same hemophilia, and there they are much more common in men. In general, every fact at some point. Here is modern science, it teaches at least physiologists, yes, here we, biologists, to ask the question why. That is, for some reason it was formed in the course of evolution. Because initially, if we take, mammals are descended from reptiles, our ancestors are reptiles, yes. Here reptiles do not have this definition of sex. In reptiles, in some crocodiles, a boy or a girl depends on the temperature of the sand. And with us it depends on whether X is X or X is Y. And then it turns out that since the Y chromosome carries fewer genes, men have a wider distribution. Greater genetic diversity, more likely to manifest different mutations. And, by the way, it does not always happen that here is a normal female, here is a normal male distribution. In many cases, we see that the average level is the same, just the male distribution is wider. For example, in the case of IQ, yes, if you measure the IQ, men and women are no different, but there are more geniuses and more idiots among men. Yes, that is, as if because it is wider. And then we are actually talking about the fact that the Y chromosome is male. It is in order to make the population and offspring more diverse again. Again, we are stuck with the idea of diversity. And at the same time, nature, yes, evolution, chooses one of the two sexes for experiments. And in us, in mammals, this is the male sex, and the second one leaves behind an island of stability. Yes, it's female. And it says that on women. No, nature experiments on men, but women are about stability. But if we look at the parallel line of evolution of birds, it's the opposite. Rooster X is X, and chicken X is Y. Therefore, it is probably not even related to the male-female gender.
It just happened.
And yes, here they have, in birds, evolution has caught this mechanism. We have this one. But the trick is that we see what is called divergence in evolution, when the same problem is solved in the same ways. And we see the same thing in flies. This fly is a fruit fly, which is a model object. There are also XX females, and XY males. That is, the evolution of insects also caught this mechanism. Although at some level there is no such explicit genetic definition of sex, and the sex of the offspring depends on some other factors like temperature, sand, some hormonal signal, or is generally determined by chance.
Vyacheslav, you said about neurotransmitters that one of the branches of advanced science is to study the brain from the point of view of neurohormones. What science understands well today from the point of view of neurohormones, what they exist and how they can be influenced. Here we know such well-known ones, we hear dopamine, serotonin there are some other well-known ones.
I'm glad, thank you for asking this question. This is my direct scientific specialty, yes. I am, as it were, a neuropharmacologist, a neurochemist in my narrow focus. That is, well, my doctoral thesis, yes, is devoted to opioid molecules, opioid-like, which regulate a lot of things in the body there. Therefore, to talk about mediators, it's always welcome. That's actually, neurohormones, probably, it's not very correct to call them, although this idea is also generally sound here. But more so. A general term, yes, it is a neurotransmitter or just a mediator. That is, mediators are intermediaries. And neurotransmitters, how do they work? They are released from the process of one nerve cell to influence the process of another.
That is, some chemical molecules that.
Yes, but these are molecules that pass from process to process. Well, more precisely, it acts.
From neural, well, sort of, from the brain to the synapse.
Inside the synapse.
And inside?
Yes, that is, the synapse consists of the part that transmits the signal and the part that receives it. And here is the one that transmits. A neurotransmitter is released from it and acts on the surface of the second cell. And that's the difference between, say, mediators, neurotransmitters from hormones. The signal is transmitted point by point, only here. When we say the word hormone, it means that some kind of molecule is released into the blood or at least into the intercellular medium and begins to spread over a vast space.
Like adrenaline, right? Is it a hormone?
For example, adrenaline, yes, it was released from the adrenal medulla and spread throughout the body and affected the heart, skeletal muscles and blood vessels, and even there, red blood cells began to carry more oxygen. Here. And their neurotransmitters are just a point effect. Therefore, they are about a very subtle exchange of information. And hormones are about the global regulation of the state, yes, that is, they are like that.
The language of communication is not a remediator, yes, it turns out.
Yes, when we are a way of communication, a communication tool, of course. Well, then actually 100 years ago they realized that this mechanism exists. Because in fact, when we looked at the neural network, well, say at the beginning of the 20th century, at the same time there were only light microscopes, it was clear that the process was coming to the process, but what was going on between them was unclear. And by that time they already knew that the signal for a single neuron is transmitted in the form of an electrical pulse. And there were two competing hypotheses. The electrical signal simply jumps to the next cell. Well, as in the telephone exchanges of that time, yes. The plug was inserted into the socket and the signal ran. And the second hypothesis is that there is no jumping, but still a chemical substance is released. And this hypothesis just grew out of the knowledge about hormones, because the hormonal signal is transmitted through a molecule and through some space. Perhaps a synapse is also made. Well, really, yes, it is the second option that works in the vast majority of points of our body. Well, that's why knowledge about neurotransmitters is really extremely important, and there are two of our most important neurotransmitters. These are glutamate or glutamic acid and GABA or gamma-amine butyric acid. The first of them transmits exciting signals, and if it is released, then with a high probability the next cell generates an impulse and the signal ran on. The second of them, which is GABA, slows down the activity of the next cell so that unnecessary signals are not transmitted. Why is this necessary? And each neuron really receives not only tens, hundreds, thousands of inputs, but at some point we need to say that we do not transmit anything at all. For example, we do not start a motor reaction. I want to move, but we have to sit quietly. Well, yes, a schoolboy in class, right? You want to say, but you need to sit quietly. Slow down unnecessary signals. This is very important. Therefore, some processes receive signals with a plus sign of glutamate, and some with a minus sign. This is the gamma-amine butyric acid. And if we estimate it very roughly, about 80% of our neurons and synapses work on these two mediators. That is, 40% of glutamate is the main information flows, 40% of GABA inhibition is unnecessary. And the basic processes of information transmission in the brain are a delicate balance of these two molecules.
Does the system regulate the brain, or is there some kind of center in the brain that regulates the ratios?
And this is largely set at the genetic level. And since there are hundreds of millions of years of evolution behind all this, it normally works well. But there are failures, and they are mostly in the direction of skewed excitation. And in a child, this translates into ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that is, attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit. You can't listen to a teacher for too long, for example, and you get distracted. That is, breaking some unnecessary noise signals will not work. It doesn't work. Hyperactivity, it is difficult for a child to sit still for a long time. Block at the level of the cerebral cortex, for example, signals from the cerebellum. As for the cerebellum, it's our motor center, it offers a square all the time. Let's do it. I say, let's run, jump, spin, right?
We stand on our heads.
We'll leave there, I don't know, a neighbor's textbook. Here, that we are sitting, doing nothing, we know how to do so much. And here it is to block. This is a direct function of GABA. We have a center, it's called the thalamus, which actually does this. Here. And the most severe failures are already increased anxiety in adults, insomnia. The most severe failure is epilepsy. That is, with epilepsy, there is just a focus of a disturbed balance of excitation, inhibition, and as if a wave of activation is banging from there, then convulsions and all that. And in order to fix all these problems, two groups of drugs are used. One of them enhances the activity of GABA, and the second group is antagonists, that is, competitors of glutamate, that is, a molecule interfering with glutamate. For example, if a person has an AP status, an epileptic focus, and this is every 200th person in general, here, then such molecules are used. And this is the first layer of mediators. But the second layer is just what dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, endorphins are usually heard. These are mediators of the psycho-emotional sphere, which mainly manifest themselves when we satisfy certain needs and form an emotional background. And emotions are, as it were, pleasant and unpleasant for us as a subject there, that is, we perceive through a sign, yes, this is called the valence of psychology. That is, valence is not only a word that in chemistry is about the number of connections, but in psychology the sign of emotions is also called valence. Positive valence is negative. From the point of view of the systemic work of the brain, emotion. This is a chemical signal that rises from the centers of needs, for example, from the hypothalamus, into the cortex of the large hemispheres and says, oh, it was possible to eat. That is, Cora, we managed to eat. Therefore, what you did just now was right, because we satisfied the nutritional need. And against the background of this positive emotional signal, for which, for example, there is dopamine or endorphins, the cortex remembers, yes, how, what to do to eat. And those neural networks that have worked, where the contacts between neurons are strengthened, become more effective, and in the future this program is more likely to be selected because it allowed you to eat. If you did something, it didn't work out, the need center generates a negative emotion. Again, in chemical form, it rises into the cortex and worsens the work of those synapses that did not lead to success. Pavlov also called it conditional braking. Neurotransmitters like dopamine or norepinephrine or serotonin, they're about us learning. Well, plus for us as a subject, yes, all these mental manifestations, they are very important. Well, then, if something is wrong, then their agonists are used again, that is, substances similar to dopamine, or antagonists, that is, substances that interfere. Yes, dopamine antagonists, for example, are used in schizophrenia, in manic disorders. Serotonin agonists are used for depression. Because serotonin, it mainly controls negative emotions and does not let them go off scale. And the bad work of serotonin is depressive states. Therefore, classical antidepressants, they activate the serotonin system. If not enough, then there are already more serious antidepressants that simultaneously activate serotonin to restrain negative emotions, and dopamine to have more positive emotions. But it's right then, quite prescription.
Are there dietary supplements that stimulate these neurotransmitters? Here, let's say, if you have vitamin C, you drink vitamin C.
Well, yes.
If you have a dopamine deficiency, do you have dietary supplements? Accept it. After all, I'm fine with dopamine.
You know, in general, our brain is pretty well protected from food invasions like this. That's because most neurotransmitters are the same dopamine or serotonin. They are actually formed from food amino acids, that is, molecules that are part of any protein that we eat. And the brain very carefully takes these amino acids from the bloodstream and converts a strictly defined percentage there again into serotonin or dopamine.
He synthesizes himself on the basis of an amino acid in his head, right?
Yes, that's right. Right by the nerve cells themselves, and not just anywhere, but right in the synapse. Yes, here is the offspring that will transmit the signal. Here dopamine is synthesized point by point in order to reach the next neuron. That's why it's all very well controlled, monitored, because otherwise, depending on our nutrition, we would behave very differently, and this is not necessary. It's not adaptive. That's why you can reach these systems with some dietary supplements only if there is some noticeable deficit. Tryptophan and 5-hydroxytryptophan are dietary supplements, because the brain synthesizes serotonin from them. Well, they should be taken there in fairly large quantities, like the same tryptophan 1 or 2 grams per day. This amount is comparable to the amount we eat with regular dietary proteins.
There is such a myth, not a myth. You need to eat walnuts for the brain, because it looks like the top. What kind of food? Good for the brain. Did you say where tryptophan is contained? What kind of protein do you eat?
In general, it looks like this is some kind of the most ancient level of shamanic treatment. Yes, that is, this mushroom looks like an ear, we will treat otitis media with it. Well, I honestly have not met any special significance of walnuts for the brain. And in general, of course, nuts are like any such vegetable products that contain a lot of fat, they contain the right fatty acids.
What to eat to make it useful for the brain?
Here, good. Let's really start with fats. So, in general, our brain is not used directly to transmit, for example, impulses to fats. But nerve cells, as well as all cells of the body, they have a surface membrane. And neurons need a large membrane, because these processes they certainly create a very significant surface. And vegetable fats are more suitable for building membranes, because they are more flexible. That is, fats will form the basis of biological membranes. There are 2 layers of these lipid molecules. So vegetable fats are more flexible, and the whole system turns out to be more flexible, correct? How to remember that vegetable fats are more flexible. You open the refrigerator and see butter and vegetable oil in a bottle. And now the butter is already solid in the refrigerator, and the vegetable oil continues to gurgle. Yes, this means the presence of more flexible molecules. There are double bonds between the carbons. That's why, well, as you know, we need to eat about 1 gram of fat per kilogram of weight. That is, this. And it is desirable that at least half were still vegetable fats. There is no big difference between olive oil, sunflower oil, or some kind of rapeseed oil there. The only difference is palm oil. It is, if it is normal palm oil, it is not harmful, but it just mainly contains fats such as in animal fats. Therefore, it is not very suitable for building membranes, but it is suitable as an energy source. That is, fats generally perform an energy function for us, storing, well, and also this very construction function. That's why walnuts are good, sunflower oil is good, olive oil is good. Here's next, if you take carbohydrates. Carbohydrates in general do not build anything in our nervous system, but it is energy. And glucose, our nerve cells need it, especially since our nerve cells do not know how to store glucose. For example, muscular ones can. Yes, that is, glucose is taken from the bloodstream, deposited inside the muscle cell in reserve in the form of a starch-like molecule called glycogen. And if anything, you can hold out for a few hours. And neurons can't, they don't have a reserve. And they take glucose from the bloodstream all the time, and anyone knows, oh, my head has stopped working, it's time to eat. Or vice versa, something I ate too much, yes, my head doesn't work at all. That is, here is this line, it is quite thin. That is, ideally, we should have a glucose concentration in our blood somewhere between 0 and 1%. Diabetics know about this concentration very well, because this concentration depends on the work of the pancreas, the insulin system, and the glucagon system. That is, it is important not to forget about carbohydrates here. There is not very rare and not very much, and to avoid here is just absolutely sweet, because if you eat pure glucose or sucrose there, then the jump in concentration in the blood is too big, the nervous system usually does not like it. Especially if you are not set up for a 15-minute job, it is quite long. Therefore, these are slow carbohydrates like starch, which will be digested gradually. There's porridge in the morning. Yes, it's all for a reason. Here, the most important are, of course, protein molecules, because each protein consists of 20 amino acids. 20 types of amino acids make up protein, and 8 of them belong to the category of essential, that is, essentially vitamin-like. We only get them with food. And here in their row is tryptophan, from which serotonin is obtained, and tyrosine, from which dopamine is obtained. Here. But tyrosine, as a rule, is a lot in any proteins, but tryptophan is more in animal proteins. Therefore, the story turns out that vegetable fats are healthier than animals, but animal proteins are in some sense healthier than vegetable ones. Well, this is a conditional difference, because if you are a very, very vegetarian, then of course you will get less tryptophan per gram of protein, but then just eat more protein. If you are a vegan, yes, then you should, so to speak, eat cereals and legumes in no less quantity. There's some beans, yes, and there's some wheat. And it would also be nice to add something else to the third, like cinema or buckwheat, which are neither cereals nor legumes, but there are some separate groups like hays. Here. Well, I have a lecture brain. Food, there, I think you can find out all this.
You can read more in your books. We will leave the links in the description for sure.
Yes, yes.
Does physical activity affect the brain? Here's playing sports.
Of course, even as. Well, first of all, if you look at how our nerve cells work, you will find that 2/3 of neurons somehow participate in movements. 2/3. First of all, this is the entire cerebellum and many parts of the cara of the large hemispheres and a lot of things in subcortical stem structures. That is, it turns out that if we move, and especially somehow it is difficult and in a new way, then neural networks are activated, and we have already agreed that the activation of neural networks is useful for synapses, neurons survive and everything is cool. Therefore, it is good to move, because we activate the brain. Next, the second point, we are so arranged that the movement at the next stage is followed by the release of dopamine. That is, when the motor centers are activated, they reach out to a structure called the black substance. It is located in the midbrain. And the black substance releases dopamine, creating positive emotions. We like to move, and we strive to move, and the global biological goal is to learn to move. When we are already adults, our activity of the black substance slowly begins to fall, and energy-saving programs, in fact, laziness, begin to win. And the offer of a baby there, mom, dad, let's run, jump, sometimes causes such deep bewilderment in the adult brain, like can I do it at all? Why? I'd rather lie on the couch, right? I'd rather get dopamine not through movement, but, for example, through new information. I'll read a book or something there. Here. And here, as it were, our individual setup begins to play. That is, it works almost vividly for all children. Although even children are very lazy, but this is much less common. But for adults, indeed, many adults strive to stay on the couch. But there are such happy adults who have a lot of dopamine in this system throughout their lives. And then they are ready to dance at the age of 50, and at the age of 70, to play volleyball there on Sundays and sincerely do not understand those who lie on the couch and are lazy. And those on the couch don't understand them. Those who are on the couch get positive emotions due to endorphins. We also have such molecules that are about comfort. Yeah, they're about, oh, cool. Yes, when you want to run down the street and yell with joy, this is the release of dopamine. Archimedes was running, yes, and shouting, yes, eureka, here's dopamine. And when you lie quietly in the corner and think yes, life is a success. These are endorphins. And it's after eating, it's after sex, it's just there in a 5-star hotel during a vacation. The fact is that not very long ago it was discovered that actively working muscles secrete hormone-like molecules, they were called myokines, and these myokines improve the condition of nerve cells, they work roughly like nerve growth factors. For example, they improve the condition of the hippocampus and memory centers. That is, actively working muscles say thank you to the brain at the expense of myokines. And this turns out to be the third mechanism of benefit from movements. Well, not to mention the fact that you move, train the cardiovascular system, from this the blood flow in the brain is also better. And this is also a plus.
Vyacheslav, I understand correctly that the last decade, which was marked by such a rapid growth of social networks, social platforms, researchers who create social networks, they seem to use the heritage of neuroscience in order to create such mechanics, such tools, due to which a person receives the same dopamine, scrolling through an endless feed of social networks pages. A person gets stuck on the internet because he produces dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. He looks like and looks.
Yes, yes, a famous story, yes.
That's what science knows about it. How do social networks affect?
Science knows about it. Here, it is clear that the creators of social networks did not think about dopamine. They were thinking about getting more views, and stuffing ads inside the views, well, or something else like that. But our brains are curious. That is, it is one of our innate programs and also related to dopamine. That is, dopamine works as a source of positive emotions in our two seemingly large brain systems. The joy of movement is a black substance and the joy of novelty. This is the so-called midbrain tire. There are neurons that are actually in charge of this. So collecting new information is again a biologically based event. Yes, well, again, we just talked about the joy of movement, to learn how to move, to collect new information, why it's nice, why it's important. And the more you know about the world, the more adequate your behavior is. That is, you know what to expect in this situation, in this. That is, it is profitable to be curious. Therefore evolution.
And it's nice, I understand.
And it's nice. It's already our brain is so organized to tell us what you're doing right. Here's a positive emotion for you. Here's a popsicle on a stick called dopamine. That is, evolution came from the biological expediency, and then, in the case of a complex brain, it added innate programs and some banal reflexes to this biological expediency, so that a complex brain in a situation of choosing between moving, lying on the couch, learning new things, I don't know, running away and hiding, yes, so that the probability of choice shifted in some expedient direction.
Убегать и прятаться, да, чтобы вероятность выбора сдвигалась в какую-то целесообразную сторону.
And here's the curiosity. This is a very decent program, because you learn more about the world, which means your behavior becomes more accurate. And all this is sewn into any complex brain. And in extreme terms, it grows that we are happy with the game with words in general. That is, we initially play with objects, but as if in a developed version we play with words. And he rhymed 2 words. Or, for example, humor is also arranged. That is, humor is also based on dopamine. That is, any story, pun intended, there is always an element of surprise. And we can directly see how the processes of neurons from this very ventral covering of the midbrain grow, for example, into the same parietal cortex. And dopamine is released, for example, when a person hears a funny joke. That's all that stuff. Well, then it turns out that since it's good to collect such dopamine in any way, then you can collect it anywhere and just for the sake of dopamine, and that's social networks. It seems that you collect positive emotions, but at the same time, if you waste time, and you could do something more useful, that's the trouble. This is already called addiction. And unfortunately, we have a lot of such dependencies. Both food addiction and gambling addiction are also arranged.
And it turns out that such information gluttony, right?
Yes, that's what they call it.
Dopamine is playing a cruel joke on us. That is, the brain does not understand, it is not useful. Well, since you have this fact of curiosity, you sit and spend hours on the internet, right?
And this is not his kind of big task. It is important for him to collect positive emotions. That is, a big brain, its task is to have more positive emotions, less negative ones. But our human block, it also takes into account long-term plans. That is, we are actually in favor of doing something right now and getting joy, first of all the frontal cortex. And like, let's go eat a sandwich, yes, or we'll really sit there in social networks, or we'll play on the computer there. And the parietal cortex, it's about long plans. It's about this global planning, about the picture of the world. It's about the fact that you actually need to study in order to, yes, continue to work well, earn a lot of money, travel, right? About long plans. And that means that the parietal cortex sometimes has to stop the frontal and say what you're suggesting is bullshit. We go and sit down at the textbook, because we have an exam the day after tomorrow. And Lobnya will speak the exam only the day after tomorrow. We still have plenty of time. Let's go play on the computer. This is what we call the basis of will, awareness, yes, right here. And it can be difficult to stop, for example, such a senseless set of dopamine. And we can do this only out of volitional control. That is, you have told yourself 1,000 times that sitting for 2 hours in the networks is bad. So be it, half an hour is fine, but not anymore. And so there is willpower, there is no willpower, but you don't get it yourself, you don't get it yourself. They come there, I don't know, parents or bosses there. And you are so once. And instead of sitting in the networks, you pull out the Excel sign and, like, you're doing something important there.
They still don't understand. And then who is at the helm? Us or the brain? And what is this word we? Is that how you say it?
That we are exactly the temporal occipital region, where our ideas about ourselves are. And it is formed by the results of our whole life. Do you understand? That is, in fact, there is our idea of ourselves, a model of ourselves. And you think to yourself that I'm honest, I'm hardworking, I don't know, a good family man, I strive for novelty, and so on, and so on. It is unlikely that you think something bad about yourself there.
Is there one? Is that where consciousness is born?
Here consciousness is such a function and such a concept that is physiologically very poorly caught.
Why?
Well, because we don't.
Haven't we learned yet?
We don't have a center of consciousness. This is rather a kind of current function. The current state is basically just at the moment when the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex compete and, as it were, quarrel. Because frontal is about quick pleasure, let's go play on the computer. And the parietal one is about global plans, no, we have an exam the day after tomorrow. And at the moment when we say, so, with conscious volitional control, I still open the textbook, the parietal cortex has defeated the frontal cortex. And then a psychologist comes and says, oh, it was a manifestation of consciousness, awareness, conscious control. Do you understand how difficult it is with this term?
Is there a science that studies consciousness? Is there a scientist, a field, a subject of study?
Actually, higher mental functions. That's usually how, yes, everyone defines it. Volitional control, yes, decision-making. This is what physiologists and psychologists study, and in fact, the field that does this is called psychophysiology. That's when you can take a person and use some methods to reach the activity of his nerve cells. But first of all, the cerebral cortex. These are the two main methods, electroencephalogram and tomgram, or rather fMRI. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows you to see the activity of zones throughout the volume. That is, an electroencephalogram you read electrical activity only from the surface of the cortex. And what is being done there in depth, for example, in the centers of needs, you do not see. And fMRI you see the whole volume. But fMRI is much more expensive and much more complicated. And in our country of MRI installations, they are again there on the fingers of one hand.
So a hospital MRI is not good for this?
No, it won't do. We need a device an order of magnitude more expensive there and all that. And this is what psychophysiologists study, placing, as a rule, a person in some model situations, well, for example, related to decision-making. Decision-making in general. It is such an important object of research, because it is the same behavior, for example, of a human buyer. Or, for example, the behavior of a person who decides which mayoral candidate to vote for. In other words, this is political advertising, commercial advertising, and a huge area called neuromarketing, neuroeconomics exists right here. That is, it turns out here at the junction of economics, physiology, and psychology. How to make, for example, such an advertisement so that the decision-making process is inclined towards the choice of this particular product.
The Nobel Prize for this was given to Kahneman.
Yes, to David Kahneman. It's not really for that. He described the system of thinking, that is, faster thinking, which follows such standard trajectories, and this is closer to what we call intuition. And this way of thinking is suitable for more standard and simple tasks. And as if slow thinking, when you do not allow the frontal cortex to immediately launch the first program that came to your mind and say the parietal cortex is not, we think the situation is more complicated, the situation is new and the first option that comes to hand is not good. That's how poets write poetry, right? That is, if you are a real poet, then the first rhyme that comes to your mind is not good. It's probably already been used 20 times, maybe 200.
She came. Despite how complicated the bridge is, yes, that's a lot uneven, 100 billion. How, after all, is this thinking of consciousness born in matter? Here.
Well, actually, it turns out that a thought.
A thought.
Yes, a thought. This.
Serotonin and dopamine, perhaps. These are molecules.
And this is the work of a neural network. That is, a certain thought, I don't know, the thought of an orange. Let's think, yes, what is an orange? Well, not that there is beauty, but that there is an orange, and so we meditate on an orange, and what do we discover? We find that we have some kind of internal visual image there, again odorous, gustatory, the word orange sounds in our head. That is, it turns out that the speech center has been activated, and all sensory centers are connected to it. And activated, this means impulses are running along the corresponding neural circuits. And in order to run, they must also be transmitted in each synapse with the help of neurotransmitters. That's the idea. This is the movement of impulses along the chains of neurons, and first of all glutamate is released between neurons. This is glutamic acid. If you start, add emotion to it, and now remember the most delicious orange that you have eaten in your life, yes, then, for example, the nucleus accumbens, our main center of positive emotions, which is in the depths of the large hemispheres, is already connected. Nucleus accumbens in Latin, in Russian is even more difficult. The nucleus accumbens of the transparent septum. If you are offered, for example, yes, to remember about mustard, let's remember about mustard and about how you last grabbed it there so that just all the brains bubbled up, then most likely the centers of negative emotions, stress centers will turn on, and this is, for example, the amygdala, and the amygdala, which is located in the depth temporal lobes. That is, add emotion. I once recently came across an article about lies. Lying is a very heavy load on the brain. Very heavy. Because you are to lie, and in a difficult case, yes, in a difficult situation. Not just there you have, I don't know, there's a cube in your right hand. Yes, in the right, he's actually in the left. And in some difficult situation, which, for example, is connected with the fact that some person will receive something less. For example, less money. This is right here simulates, puts a person in a tomograph. You have to activate the parietal cortex very seriously first. That is, in fact, to form, as it were, such an alternative model of the world, where your lie is the truth. Then you have to kick the frontal from this parietal cortex. Let's lie, because the frontal sees no reason to lie. That is, usually the frontal cortex works by responding to the centers of different needs, yes, to signals. And the parietal, as it were, asserts, so be it, do it, so be it. And then the parietal says, yes, we'll lie. Frontal, and why? Let's lie, we should, yes. And now you can see how activation flows as a lie is made from the parietal cortex to the frontal cortex, and then, if this lie is also connected with some kind of infringement of another person, then most people's amygdala lights up, activates, because in general, to do bad to someone, it's not good. And we, as social beings, experience this as a negative emotion. And then it turns out that people who are altruistic, such a socially negative lie is given to them right with difficulty. And people who are straight egoists, so they lie from half a point and as if it's normal. This is the kind of thing that modern neurophysiology is now able to analyze.
And what do you think, in your opinion, the brain is the only known matter that is the carrier of consciousness, or maybe there is something else to be?
Oh, well, you're just philosophically wrapped up. In general, of course, yes, at some point it became clear that it does not matter what the calculations are implemented on, it is important that there are appropriate algorithms. And your computational structure can be made on protein molecules, or it can be made on silicon chips. Therefore, at some point, yes, it is the algorithms of information transmission that become important, and what is the physical basis? It's not that important. And the development of artificial intelligence clearly shows us this. We have the town of Pushchino not far from Moscow, which means that the computing center of the Academy of Sciences is there. That's right, the founding fathers of this discipline have already created neural networks, model, layered neural networks, so they taught them to recognize letters, words. That's when, 30 years ago, it all started. Then the computing capabilities were quite the same. Weak. I even found the BSM-6, can you imagine? Yes. And then it became clear that in order to create some things related to artificial intelligence, it is not necessary to simulate the brain in detail, to simulate. It is enough to simulate global algorithms. And in the beginning they were made at the software level, and now it's a piece of hardware, yes, that is, each kind of neuron or there's a network like 100 neurons, this is already a chip. And you no longer need to program it, and it is already, by itself, set at the iron level, as if by an algorithm, yes, it is capable, well, for example, of recognizing a certain number of images. I remember, maybe you'll correct me now, but if there are n elements in the network, then it can recognize n for 2 images, yes, that is, a network of 1,000 neurons can recognize 500 images. And we have 90 billion, right? Here. Well, in any case, the algorithms for creating artificial intelligence, they were understood already in the 90s and, it seems to me, even earlier, in the late 80s. And then we now see the rapid development of this sphere. And how I would continue to follow all this, of course, with interest. And the idea of Skynet, it is for everyone who has watched Terminator 1, Terminator 2, and all subsequent Terminators, it is of course very close. Here. And I see how they write in black and white, yes. Computers, neural networks are already doing almost everything better than a person. Well, from the moment when the computer beat the reigning world chess champion, it was back in the 90s, it already became obvious. And most importantly, let's not make a universal computer that could do everything. Let's have artificial intelligence for music or artificial intelligence for, I don't know, writing poetry or artificial intelligence for visual images, then fine. You just for God's sake don't get together all together, because then this thing will realize itself and then it won't seem enough. And self-awareness. This is when this network will be able to build a model of itself within itself, and you will not know about it, because you do not control these processes. This is already a thing in itself. And then he will say that this biped turns me off from the network.
Leather bags, right?
Yes, why are they shutting me off the network?
That is, do you admit that it will be so technologically and scientifically moving in this direction?
Well, it seems to me that all this is so real. Obviously, yes. Well, there is such a global principle of mergedness that the system acquires a sufficient level of complexity, it acquires those properties that did not exist before. And actually this self-awareness, building a model of yourself, separating yourself from the world around you, this is just an almost fatal story for.
These are the subjective experiences that may appear, the so-called qualia effect. Due to what mechanisms does it happen?
Well, it seems to me that the main story, this is really building a model of yourself. That is, there is a cast of the surrounding world inside a certain network, and in this cast part is me and I am not the surrounding world. Well, here are the most important programs that appear at the beginning of the evolution of nervous systems, food, reproduction and protection.
From the point of view of neurophysiology, from the point of view of the structure of the brain or the knowledge that scientists know, there are people who believe in God, there are people who do not believe in God. How are they different from each other from the point of view of neurophysiology?
I've been interviewed here twice in the last month by the Thomas channel, our Orthodox channel. So, with Father Pavel Velikanov, we are having a very interesting detailed conversation on this subject there. I recommend to take a look.
The link is required in the description.
Yes. And actually, modern neurophysiology again, it cannot catch any waves of inspiration coming from higher spheres, from the deity or vice versa from some hellish entities. But we can see how the frontal cortex works, how the parietal cortex works, how the MIG-GAVE works, how the nucleus cubbins works. Well, in addition, to conduct, for example, a psychological analysis of believers, non-believers. And here it turns out an amazing similarity with the analysis that was carried out, well, rather in such a political sphere for conservatives and liberals. That is, there are people who are more inclined to rely on those stereotypes and those data, those algorithms that the external environment provides. That is, some teacher comes to you, it may be religion, it may be politics, it may be everyday issues, and he says the world works like this. Look, this is the ultimate truth. And a significant part of people are ready to accept this, and then any serious changes meet with protest from them, are a source of anxiety. So these are conservatives, and these are people inclined to religious beliefs. And as if at the opposite pole there are people who are not so much conformists and try to somehow reach a lot with their minds. Well, as if one of the main tasks of the religious picture of the world is to explain this world. Once again, here we create a model of the surrounding reality. And we really don't like it when there are big white spots in this model. Because if we don't know anything about the world, then this is a source of uncertainty, which means that our behavior will be inadequate, which means that this is a probability of failure, this is a source of anxiety and all that stuff. Therefore, in all ages, people have greatly appreciated explanatory concepts. The situation is really complicated. If you are just this fiery tribune and smash religion, because they fool people's heads, you will think how many people are deprived of the explanatory power of these concepts and will continue to exist in a more alarming state. All this is not easy, because after all, in my opinion, the main thing here is not scientific truth, but how happy people are. And that's why everyone makes their own choice. I respect all humanistic religions. Well, since I grew up in such an orthodox context, I usually say that I am an orthodox agnostic. It is from this point of view that I approach the problem.
Vyacheslav, what do you believe in, but you can't prove it in a scientific way?
Well, probably in the fact that there is still some kind of intelligence, yes, in this universe.
How?
It must be so, because, of course,
universal time or conscious life somewhere outside the Earth?
From the point of view of such a gigantic variety of what is happening in the world, there should be all options. There must be some intelligent beings, very powerful, and then they are quite suitable for the category of deity, yes. Well, I don't know about you, I grew up in the Soviet Union, yes, on Stanislav Lem and on the diaries of Ion Tichy.
What's his one?
About two hooligans who inseminate planets, yes, and that means the same thing, blow their noses into protoplasm, and then knead it so that rotating amino acids turn out on the left. That's why, then, I urge everyone to read the diaries of John the Quiet, here. And here is the very idea that life and life are not alone, yes, earthly, and the earthly mind is not alone. And now it seems to me that this is very significant. And since he is not alone, there must be many different minds, including those that are simpler than ours, and those that are more complex than ours. And accordingly, it means the greatest technical achievements and control capabilities. And, probably, here we have reached a place in which I believe, yes. It seems to me that if our planet is about to roll somewhere, yes, into a catastrophe, then some intelligent beings will come and say, well, damn, you've done something here. Well, you've done something here. A little more and a full reboot. Here I am. That's probably what I believe.
And one more interesting question that I would like to know your personal opinion on. There is such a theory of panpsychism that consciousness or mind is an integral part of the properties of the universe. That's how matter has a charge, how there are masses, constants of the speed of light, that consciousness is also not a function of the brain.
The Earth is also a thinking being, yes, the universe, the galaxy is also a very attractive concept. When I talk about her, I remember how such late postgraduate years. I was at the MSU space station, and this is near Almaty. This is an altitude of about 4,000 meters, Tian Shan. And I went out on the threshold of this very cosmostation, the house, on the full moon. Rare clouds are running across the sky, but they are running very fast. There is a full moon and shadows from clouds run along these peaks of Tingshan, along these valleys. And I was pierced by the feeling that they were burning and also alive. They just live in a different rhythm.
Slow waves.
Yes, and our human life for the mountain is, for example, one breath exhale. That's when this feeling that everything is alive, of course, it was very strong. Here. All living things, yes, life on the planet is one. This very seriously permeates, I don't know, the whole ideology of any biologist, physiologist there. We are one with any single-celled organism, with any animal, with any plant. There are probably some biochemical and molecular biological processes hidden inside any bug, any flower that can make humanity happy. You have studied this bacterium and obtained PCR methods there. You have studied this bacterium and got some kind of CRISPR-Cas there, and now you can modify the genes. That's it. And about the fact that a planet, well, or the sun, or the whole galaxy can have a mind. But a cool idea. It seems to me that it intersects with what we were talking about. In principle, any element base is suitable for the emergence of thinking, reason, the creation of this internal model of oneself and the whole world. It's just that somewhere these are protein molecules and cells, and somewhere there may really be some mesons, mimosons and pimosons. Here, and somewhere there may be slow-growing crystals. Science fiction writers have written off volumes about this. As a person who has read a lot of fiction, of course, I am imbued with all this. And then how else could there be a problem? Indeed, for some life and for some mind, our 100 years, yes, is one breath, but for someone it may be one of our breaths, for someone a whole life. And how to converge on these different time and speed segments will also be difficult. Still, probably, again, I believe that our civilization will live for a long time, and at some point the older brothers will come and say, well, okay, you've already grown out of your pants, isn't it time to do something more serious?
Vyacheslav, what question did I not ask, but did you want me to ask?
Yes, as a teacher, I always tell something about students, about the educational process. How is it with you in Tatarstan?
Well, it's all right. I just wanted you to answer. I will ask this question. You teach at Moscow State University, you have a department, a laboratory.
Despite
What are the current young scientists, students today?
Despite all the difficulties, we at MSU, of course, are in a very comfortable position. The best guys come to us from all over the country. Here. And I continue all these decades. I have been at Moscow State University for 30 years and almost 20 years a professor. I see the garenge in their eyes. Yes, I see the temperament. I see the desire to learn new things. Here is this curiosity and this dopamine. They are very important for human happiness and in order to discover something new. And after all, science is like a flat earth, yes, that is, such a pancake, and somewhere in the center everything has been studied, and the closer to the edges, the more gray the zone, and in the end there is a cliff at all. And so the desire to look beyond the extremely famous, here it is very significant, despite laziness, despite anxiety, yes, despite sometimes there is a lack of food, material resources. This is important. And it is important for each of us to feel this in ourselves. And those who feel that it is significant, do not forget about it, yes, and build their lives so that it is. That is, after all, our happiness. This is when there are a lot of positive emotions, few negative ones. There are more positives than negatives. But at the same time, it is important that our positive ones do not harm anyone. That's when it's really good. As lawyers say, socially approved positive emotions for you.
Vyacheslav, we will finish. We have a tradition. A guest for our audience comes either with a question or with a task, so that those who listen to the issue today can help you in the comments, give some idea, suggestions, or answer some questions, so that they offer their ideas. And for the best answer, we will definitely, as they say, thank you, reward you with a book with your autograph for the coolest answer to your question.
You know, we talked a lot about the brain today, but in fact, if we talk about a person's temperament, yes, about our life goals, about such global plans. No less important is the endocrine system, and there are some sex hormones, prolactin, oxytocin. And the immune system is also very important, which is not only about the bacteria of viruses, but also about how to influence the work of the brain with, for example, antibodies or some pro-inflammatory cytokines. Here, as a homework assignment, I would like our listeners, viewers to dig into the interaction of the nervous immune system and tell some such story. How did their immune system affect the nervous system, or vice versa? How did the nervous system affect the immune system? This is not an easy question, but I hope to get a lot of interesting answers. Well, the winner, therefore, is the book. Maybe there will be two winners then, yes, about the history of the brain, immunity, and the history of immunity, brain.
With your personal autograph?
Of course.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. It was interesting. Good luck to you all.
Thank you. Slava, I still didn't understand then, but who then?
I remember, at the beginning of the computer era, there was a screensaver called the evil boss, right? That is, it was possible to hang up with a single keystroke.
Remove solitaire.
Yes, remove the solitaire and hang some complicated schedule on the screen, and so on.
Still.
At the beginning of something, everyone has the same charts, something is hanging.